Hello, fellow Rebel Capitals. Hope you're well. I've got my good buddy Chris MacIntosh back, and we're going to talk about copper and the insanity that's going on. I know the other day, intraday, it was up like 17%. So I want to go into copper, and I want to talk about how that plays into Chris's macro thesis and the commodity super cycle we talk about all the time, and how that may play into different stocks in areas that I'm very bullish on, such as Argentina. So, Chris, what on earth is going on with copper?
Well, we've got the US government under Orange Man Bad has come out with some some interesting. I posted a tweet on X the other day, yesterday, maybe the day before, and I said something to the effect that either Donald Trump is economically illiterate and has the best interests at heart, but he's economically illiterate, or he's just a complete muppet. And I'm going to go with the second. And the reason for that is that you can manufacturing, you can change, right? So the original design behind the tariffs, at least purportedly, was that he would use tariffs in order to bring back manufacturing and businesses and so on and so forth to the US, which is, you could say, well, that's a valid sort of way about going about sort of fixing some of the issues that have been in play for the last few decades, right? It's just been the offshoring of talent and the offshoring of production and so on and so forth, which has now put the US in this predicament whereby much of the production now happens offshore, and all you're left with is a mighty dollar and a lot of debt and a big military. Anyways, but you can't do that with minerals, especially if you don't produce any of those minerals, right? So like you can't bring back copper production to the US. Like, it doesn't exist. I mean, there's a tiny bit, but it's not, the vast amount of copper production happens offshore. So it didn't really make a whole lot of sense on that front. So I just sort of laughed at it. I thought this is kind of amusing.
Let me play devil's advocate. I'll be the defender of Orange Man here for a moment. Do you think it's okay? Well, we can mine the copper here in the United States. We just need the incentive to. And if I go ahead and increase or create a 50% tariff on all this copper we're importing, then that's going to incentivize mining here in the United States. And even if that takes 10 years, then we're going to build up that capacity to where we're not as dependent on foreign countries for something that is as important as copper itself. Do you think that's a decent argument?
Like anything, it's never that simple, right? So there's a couple of components to, especially something that is of the degree of mining. Bringing back production isn't just a one-stop issue. It's not like you just bring out 50% tariffs and then within 6 or 12 months or even 24 months, you have sufficient incentive, largely as a consequence of prices, right? Readjusting in the market and capitalism taking hold to the degree now that you would have explorers and developers and everything else going out and looking for copper and mining it and off you go. There's a couple of issues with that. One is if it worked, and it's unlikely that it will, but if it did work in that fashion, a very linear sort of thinking, right, it would still take many, many years, right? To the extent of probably 5 years would be extraordinarily fast to actually just bring on a copper mine.
And who knows what the tariffs are going to be then? The tariffs might go back to zero.
It's much more likely it's a 10-year time frame. Now, there's there's a whole raft of other there are reasons why the US is roughly 5% supply of the copper market, and Chile is 23%. There's a number of reasons, and one of those reasons is that the NIMBY, right, not in my backyard situation exists across the US. Additional to that, at the federal level, where the US Trump comes out and says, we're doing these tariffs, that doesn't in any way, shape, or form impact local regulations, local permitting, and so on and so forth across the country. Now, if once prices move, there is a mechanism in place such that certain jurisdictions, let's just say for argument's sake, Texas, which is, shall we say, somewhat more capitalistic in terms of a state than say California or anywhere else. Now, they might look at this and go, hey, we should take advantage of this. How can we go about assisting the mining community to do da-da-da-da-da? That process at a local government level is still not a rapid process. right?
Right.
So you would like if this happened within a 10-year time frame, it would be bloody fast for the US just to increase, say, double its output, which would only take it to like roughly 10% of global supply, everything else being equal. Now, what happens in the middle of that? Because this is a very, there's Dr. Copper. It's a very economically sensitive mineral.
Right.
What happens, because copper, and the reason simple, copper goes into almost everything that is manufactured, right? So now what happens to the rest of the manufacturing supply chain when you're paying 50, like before you get to this doubling of supply, this mythical beautiful world of a doubling of supply, that would require legislative changes across the board. It would require a whole lot of different things. It would require credit to be able to come into the market, which, by the way, has been, with the whole bullshit net zero banking and all these other issues, has also impacted the ability for miners to actually bring supply to the market. So it's not merely just a regulatory issue at a localized level or even tariffs. There are many, many mechanisms that are in place as to why the market is the way it is. Changing all of those does not happen even in like a year or two. It happens across a multi-year time frame ordinarily. Okay, there are some changes, and we can get to Argentina in a minute. But because Argentina has made significant changes, but to get to that is requires a control of Congress. It requires actually a huge amount of pain in order to get people to be able to be sufficiently incentivized to go about making what are incredibly drastic changes. It's my opinion that the United States is nowhere near sort of
Yeah.
painful enough to be able to do that, and it doesn't really have the mechanisms
Yeah,
in the legal.
so the bottom line there is we're looking at, if everything went perfectly, we're looking at a, let's just say, 7-year process, just optimistically speaking. And this is if the producers that are having to put billions of dollars into capex to dig more holes in the ground, if they assume that the Trump tariffs are going to be there indefinitely. And as we know,
You've got
they
it.
they
It's
may
an election
be, they might
cycle.
not be, and then what
I
happens
mean,
when Trump's gone, and now all
what
of
are
a sudden
we?
I've got this 7-year
Yeah.
investment. I mean, so the probability is very low, but let's assume that it did play out that way. The question then becomes what happens in the 7 years when the copper prices go way, way up, and that impacts every other industry in the United States negatively, by the way. And or what happens if we get a quick recession here and the copper price goes down, and then those producers are like, hey, even if I think the tariff's going to be here forever, the price of copper just doesn't justify it right now, and therefore I'm not going to do it. Then you come out of that recession and prices go even higher for all these inputs, such as the new economy, AI, electric vehicles, data centers, etc.
It's a very, very good question. There's a lot of competing forces in play at the moment. AI is one in particular, which increasingly looks like it's going to decimate much of the, shall we say, the white collar businesses. I mean, we just saw,
Or jobs, yeah.
or jobs. I mean, accountants are just being laid off. Like, I saw the amount of accountants that KPMG are bringing on is down something like 28%. Everybody, I think, to some degree understands the impact that can be and is taking place within that space. So that's a deflationary impact, right? And then at the same time, what you have with a couple of things: copper, just this tariff thing, that's an inflationary impact. Why? Just because it's increasing the cost base on a production. Like if we're running a business and we've got all these line items, and one of those line items is copper, and now it's 50% more expensive, it's an inflationary impact on our balance sheet and on our income statement. So simple, right? So there are other forces in place as well that are affecting the broader market. But the fact that copper is being used is interesting because like I said, it's in everything. The other component behind this that needs to be addressed is that things don't happen in isolation, right? So while the US might say, okay, we're going to do this, what does that do? Well, to some degree, it can also do the very opposite of what Trump's tariffs were purportedly meant to do, i.e., if we are running a business and we are fairly heavily dependent on the copper price, you and I, let's say we're sitting in Miami or wherever, somewhere in the US, and we now have this high line item can we, and maybe we manufacture something that we export.
Yeah, right.
What does that look like? Well, I'll tell you what it looks like. It looks like us moving. That's what it looks like.
Yeah, yeah.
It looks like potentially
Or
picking
being
up sticks
a
and going,
massive competitive
we got to go to Mexico.
disadvantage, or being a huge disadvantage is what you're saying, to your
Exactly.
competitors that are outside of the United States that can get that input cost at a fraction of the price. And so
Exactly.
it's does the exact opposite of the stated intention of, let's just say, MAGA economics. Chris, I don't know if we're both good buddies with Richard Werner,
Mhm.
and he was on the PBD podcast back Liberation Day. And Patrick Bet David is a really smart dude, great guy. I like him a lot. And but he's not incredibly sophisticated when it comes to macroeconomics, but he's very inquisitive and he asks very good questions. So he was asking Werner about his opinion on tariffs, and Werner was just giving a very objective view. And he's like, for some cases it's good, for some cases it's bad. It really depends on whether you're a developed economy. But the main takeaway and the main point of his answer to PBD was you would never, ever, ever put a tariff on a raw material, because the objective of the tariff itself is to give your country a competitive advantage with goods that are added value. So, as an example, you would never put a tariff on copper. You would put a tariff on the robots that the United States produces with that copper input. And to dovetail on top of that, I moderated a debate between Schiff and this guy Spencer Morrison, who's kind of at the forefront of the MAGA economic movement, and he is very, very, very pro tariff, very pro tariff.
Mhm.
But even he said in that debate that he would never suggest putting tariffs on raw materials.
Yeah, look, I mean, the only counter I would have to that is if you were basically a nation that solely had, if you're
That was
producing
your
just oil
only economic,
and you essentially
right?
have no manufacturing and no
Yeah,
higher value service industry or anything of that nature, and you are dominant in that market, like you own 50, 60% of something of that nature in that market, you can control it. You literally have a monopoly. Would you use that? Probably. And, almost silly not to from a power sort of geopolitical standpoint. But those countries almost don't exist anymore to the degree that they might have in the past.
yeah,
And that doesn't really apply in this. It certainly doesn't apply to the United States. It doesn't apply to any of the European countries. And look, I mean, we've seen this to some degree before. Like the countries that actually benefit the most are countries which have that productive output in value added goods.
yeah,
How is it that Singapore is so wealthy on a relative basis? And it's like Singapore was only 40, 50 years ago a malaria infested swamp at the end of the Malay Peninsula. Like it didn't have anything
yeah,
other than a port. And so and a lot of what, so for a country like that, trade deals are incredibly important, but they're a value add type economy, and those are the economies that actually, again, you take Dubai, you take Hong Kong, a lot of these things, it's not down to the commodity itself, it's what you do with that particular commodity. So hence coming all the way back and saying, oh, we're going to hit the commodity, kind of just it's really myopic. It doesn't like, there's no understanding of the mechanisms of, like, how do you get that right? It's not, sure, you need the underlying base commodity, and that's incredibly important, but it's the manufacturing of it.
yeah. The only
And so
winner
there's
there are the copper producers that currently exist in the United States. They're the only winners, and the consumers, everyone else in the United States economy, the producers that use it as an input, they're all losers. So you have to look at the trade-offs, and there's just 10x the
and
losers than
and
there are the winners.
and this gets to a broader problem, which I'll bring up, which is that when you're taking, so like, what impact does this have, for example, on GDP? Like when
Right.
you look at the trajectory of travel here, this is what's really important for people to understand, because whether there's a tariff that comes in or not, to some degree, is just part of the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is this: the US has got, like, what, 36.4 trillion in federal debt. GDP is like 29. So you're running about 125 debt to GDP. Now, go back to the pandemic. We had 20 trillion in debt, 21 in GDP. Okay. So since then, government sector has basically climbed by roughly 80%. and GDP only by 20%. That's a mass, like, and there wasn't that long ago. It was like 4 or 5 years ago, right? So this is why now we're running what 7% annual deficits when for decades it was like 3.8, 4%, just under 4.
Right.
So now the issue becomes your serviceability of that, and we can get into the bond market, and that's a whole different discussion, maybe for another day. But when you take these tiny little steps, it's like death by 1,000 cuts. What does this do for manufacturing in the US? What does it do for inflation? As a consequence, what does it do for, available additional capital from businesses, from individuals? Like none of it's positive. In other words, does this benefit
Yeah. Well,
GDP?
again,
Probably
no,
not.
I don't know that it's really inflation. It might be inflationary in the short term, but over the midterm, I think it's actually disinflationary, and not in a good way, in a bad way, from the reduction of economic output, because the input
Productivity goes
prices
down.
you have to have
Productivity
goes
goes
up.
down.
Yeah, so you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. It's just like the oil price going to 150 a barrel.
Yep.
That sure, near term that might cause inflation, but midterm that's likely going to cause a
Yep.
recession, especially if you're kind of teetering on the edge, as it is. You want to hear? I'll give you an angle that you've probably never thought of, and for all the viewers here, all else being equal, if the copper price stays this high in the United, or stays extremely high in the United States, you might want to buy Home Depot. And I'll tell you why. Because Chris, as you know, I got into real estate in 2012 when I retired. And I went in and bought all of these rental properties in good neighborhoods, but they were in Lee's Summit and Blue Springs, this place in Kansas City, Missouri, right? And they're these single family, 3-bed, 2-bath, 4-bed, 2-bath, something like that. And at the time, the copper price was very high. I don't remember what it was. You probably know better than I would, but it's probably a lot lower than it is going to be today, assuming that these tariffs stay in place. And you almost had to have like a manned guard watching every single one of your properties, even in the good neighborhoods, because the meth heads, the drug addicts, and the homeless people, they would break into your house. They would steal your air conditioner just to get the copper out of it, and then they would break into your house. They would go into the basement and they would clip all of your copper plumbing. And so you'd have to go. So I get a call from like my GC, and he'd be like, "Yeah, just FYI, your basement's flooded." And I'd be like, "Why?" He said, "Because the crackheads went in there and clipped out all of your copper piping. So then what we'd have to do is we'd have to go to Home Depot. That's where that plays in. And we'd have to buy all new pipe, but we'd get the PVC stuff. So they couldn't, or they didn't have an incentive to steal it. Or you'd have to go out and buy a new air conditioner." I know a lot of my buddies that were kind of in the landlord game, they would take the AC unit and they would figure out how to put it on the roof and
Oh, yeah.
put like a cage over it or something like that,
Yeah.
just to keep the people from stealing the
Yeah,
copper.
yeah, yeah.
So my point
I
there is that if copper
mm,
stays very high, just beware, because all that copper pipe, that's just game on for the crackheads.
it's funny you say that because you're talking about 20, what was it? You said
That's
2012.
2012. So like 2012, 2013.
Yep. So 2012, I was in Mongolia, and so you had that commodity boom, right? So you because it did, like copper had bottomed back in like sort of with the '08 crisis, right? It crashed, it like halved. And then we had the rally from sort of early 2009 through 10, 11, and 12, and it was up a lot. And Mongolia is it's a poor country, right? And so they would have, like, you'd walk down the sidewalks, and they'd put this wasn't copper, by the way. It was just I guess it would have been cast iron manhole covers, and they all just disappeared. Like everybody would take them because they were, they were too valuable, because the commodity price was high. So you had to really watch that you didn't fall down a hole, because these things would just get stolen. And then even in the road, like sometimes they have them in the road, right? And they're gone. So you're driving down the road, you got to watch that you don't disappear down a manhole. And
Wow.
it was hilarious. But so incidentally, that's often a time when you start looking at things, and like if you're invested into something at that time, you probably actually that's when you want to start looking to get out,
Yeah, so
because
that's a good question, Chris, because I'm assuming that in your fund, and with your managed accounts, the money you manage, you own some copper producers. Is that a correct statement?
Very tiny positions. We're not.
Okay.
Copper is a it's a economically sensitive commodity, and so it's the nuance behind it is that it's much more tied to, I guess, things that we are not as convinced about. So, for example, you kind of want to have commodities that can do well in when an economy doesn't. In other words, not so
Right.
economically sensitive. And then we've got a lot of technological innovation. So AI, for example, and new tech always devalues old tech, right? So you kind of want to own the commodities that I think are going to benefit as a consequence of both the sort of deflationary impact from things like AI, but also just from a structural deficit. There hasn't actually been there hasn't been like a structural deficit in copper to the degree, like, and what the move that we just see now is basically just down to political posturing. And
Yeah.
look, who knows? That could change tomorrow. We saw China was going to get what 200% tariffs, and then they wouldn't, and like it just all changes all the time. So we're more like gold is a better one, right? Because what you have, coming back to the whole debt situation and the fact that you basically have this what Lynn Alden talks about, which is the unstoppable train, right? In that environment, there's only four options that exist to solve that problem. One's taxation, the other one's confiscation, austerity, and then a debt restructuring. And the first two are almost always the ones that are utilized. Okay, taxation and confiscation, which means from a portfolio construction side of things, you want to be owning assets which, well, how do I put this? You need to be sensitive to geographies, right? You need to. I don't think that it's a wise move to have all of your assets essentially in one jurisdictional basket. I think you could have done that for the last 40, 50 years. You could have had it literally in three or four. And I feel much more like now you need to have it in like 5, 10 sort of jurisdictions. So it's not just a matter of owning the assets or owning the commodity producers or whatever that you want to be buying, but it's also in what jurisdiction are they and where do they have their assets? Because what happens in these times is that you do always have things like tariffs, things like asset seizures, confiscations, government intervention. I mean, you just see what's happening in New York. I think I saw something, a friend of mine, a client of mine who lives in there, said, no, they're looking now, they want to have the supermarkets owned by the government.
Yeah. Right.
Just,
And not
so,
just rent control, but rent freeze. Different.
so yeah, but again,
Freeze.
if you go through historically, that's entirely predictable. Like on a that's what you see at the end of debt cycle type thing. So it's not that you know exactly what those things are going to be, but you know that the probability of them is there, and so then you try and construct a portfolio to address that. And when you get new inputs, you're like, okay, shit, we're going to move this and we're going to do that, the other thing. But the key is to try and make sure that you have a portfolio that is at least cognizant of those major problems, which is that we will be taxed, there will be asset confiscation, there will be tariffs, there will be all these sorts of mechanisms which are going to disrupt the market. And then, what happens in those environments? What are the asset classes that ordinarily outperform, or at least don't lose money, right?
Yeah. 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 I agree with that. I don't know that I agree with that because the long end of the curve will go up because it's just, I can't see any evidence for supply of treasuries. I can see it in other bond markets for sure. But as far as treasuries go, I can't see any evidence that supply matters. As crazy as that sounds, as counterintuitive as that sounds. And therefore, the government would be put into a position to raise those taxes and to devalue the dollar or whatever it is to create inflation as a result of the fact they couldn't get the long end of the curve under control, or it was at an unacceptably high level. And I think the only way that it gets up to an unacceptably high level is if the government spending itself creates the inflation. If the government spending doesn't create the inflation, like Japan as an example, I don't know that you have the problem on the long end of the curve that would incentivize them to do it. I think they'll do exactly what you're saying for different reasons. Because we have so much social unrest and because they have a push towards socialism, they have a push towards deglobalization, they have a push towards mercantilism, or
Well,
whatever
look,
it is that distorts the economy, and that's what creates the inflation, not necessarily through the increase in the money supply, because I don't think the banks would play ball, but more so a supply shock, price controls, all these things that we've seen throughout the past that lead to the exact same thing.
it's government taking over greater and greater percentages of the economy, and
Yep,
that in
yep,
itself is unproductive. And
yep,
that
that's
doesn't happen in a microcosm. It doesn't. It The rest of the world still matters, and what happens now is that the rest of the world matters more. So, and again, this is a path that we've been on. So, the United States now, over 50% of the population is dependent on the government. Okay,
yeah, and
just
50% of
about.
GDP is the government.
So, what and that as we know, I mean, anything that is associated with government is ordinarily less productive and less versatile, and so on and so forth, than the private sector. We know that. That's not a debatable statement. And then you go, well, is it actually any surprise now that China and Southeast Asian countries are taking over? No, it's not, because they have a different structure, and so that just accelerates that trend. So as the government comes in to create more jobs and so on and so forth, and just by nature, it's like a cancer; it just can't stop growing,
Yeah, that's right.
and so that it takes over more and more portions of the economy, which weakens the economy structurally. So now you're just playing around with numbers, whether they inflate or deflate or whatever. It doesn't really matter, because the production, the trade, the global trade moves increasingly offshore.
Yeah, that's right.
Um, and then you get into the situation where it becomes that, and that's where we are, which is that it's a problem for the US government, because their leverage in global finance is waning. And then as a consequence, they go look around and they say, what are the tools that we have to regain and retain this level of clout? And that's monetary system and it's military. And so they've been utilizing the monetary system as a weapon. They've been weaponizing it. That's becoming a problem. It's why crypto, for example, has been legalized and incentivized outside of the US, in places like Russia in particular. And basically, it hasn't really worked. The monetary sanctions haven't worked to the degree that they had in the past. So there's that weapon, and then when that weapon fails, then you use your big bad military. And we're moving fast into a world where technology, it's always a disruptor, but we are seeing that you've got a big bloated US military, which, as powerful as it is still it's struggling now even against the Houthis, which is just a ragtag bunch of militia, essentially, with a bunch of drones. So they're
Yeah.
throwing $2,000 drones at the U.S. military, are using $1 million missiles to shoot them down. Like they can keep printing the money to pay for that expenditure to do it, but like it's a war of attrition.
Yeah, so
Anyway, the point.
Chris, in a world where geopolitics are getting more uncertain, Trump campaigned on peace and pulling back the military, and unfortunately now we're getting involved in Iran. We're getting involved now even more so with Ukraine. I was just reading the other day that Trump decided to start sending weapons to Zelensky once again. And you'd expect that in these cycles, whether it's a long-term debt super cycle like Dalio talks about, or a fourth turning, it all leads to social unrest, which leads to geopolitic uncertainty or volatility, if you will. And then that just throughout human history, people want solutions from the government. And you see this playing out in New York City, which I think is a precursor, unfortunately, for what's likely going to play out through many parts of the United States. So we're talking about increased geopolitical risk. We're talking about government, bigger percentage of GDP. We're talking about mercantilism, and we're talking about a movement, even within the United States and especially in developed economies, towards socialism. So, in that world, let's say that's what plays out over the next 5 years, 10 years. What are your top three assets that you'd like to own in your portfolio?
Yeah, you've covered a lot there. Top three assets. Well, we're in a monetary regime change cycle. That's fairly evident. In that environment, you want to own precious metals. You want to own hard asset money. I would include in that, although we don't have it in the fund for a very good reason, I would include in that potentially Bitcoin as a small percentage. Not probably for me, not more than 5% weighting. And the reason we don't own it in the fund, and the reason I would never think anyone should own it in a fund, is because part of the huge utility value behind Bitcoin is that you can self custody.
All right.
That's one of the main reasons why you own it, that and its utility value,
In
right?
other words, it's purchasing power outside of the system.
So for God's sakes, don't go and buy into anybody's fund where they're holding Bitcoin. If you want to speculate on the price of Bitcoin, that's one thing. But if you want to actually have a robust portfolio that eliminates risks, that's one of the risks that you can't, that it's most easily addressed with something like Bitcoin. So anyway,
Yeah.
so that's the Bitcoin side. Then there's precious metals. And then what we do is we basically look for deep value undervalued assets and asset classes and sectors. And so in that space, to me, energy is just, it's a standout. It's a standout because historically, cyclically,
Mhm.
it's what benefits even where you have economic degradation and decline, provided that you have an underlying supply demand imbalance. And so there's subsectors within the energy space. If you've got uranium, you've got
Talk about just really quickly uranium and nat gas, because I think about it through the lens of AI, just setting
mhm.
aside all of the economic uncertainty. And with AI, I always hear about one of two solutions or a combination of both, nuclear or nat gas. So is nat gas worth looking at? And same question for uranium.
100%. So you'll remember when we were, what was this, a month ago, when we were in Orlando at Rebel Capitalist Live, and
Yeah.
the topic of my discussion, or one of the tail end of it, was natty gas.
Okay.
And the reason's quite simple. The supply of natural gas was immense in the US as a consequence of the shale industry. Why? Because shale just, they were flaring the stuff off. There's so much natural gas, they don't know what to do with it all, right? So the boom that you had in the shale oil space, as a consequence, caused a massive supply of natural gas. You can imagine what this did to the natural gas producers, right? They're like, how do you compete with free?
Yeah.
so,
Right.
so now our supply of natural gas producers collapsed. Permian's, like all of the basins have peaked out except Permian, which looks like it is, and there's, we've been making the case for this now for quite some time, that the production from shale in the US is going to disappoint. And yet the market's still looking at what we had for the last 40 years, which was this ever increasing supply. And as an increase in supply from shale came about, there was just a plethora. There was no need to worry about natural gas. There's so much of it. They're just burning the shit off.
Right.
Now we're having a decline in all of that, at the same time that we have this massive demand coming in from AI, to the extent that AI data centers now are chewing up more than entire countries in terms of electricity usage. So this is a significant issue. And there's been many commentators far smarter than myself who've made the case that AI is the new geopolitical weapon. Whoever wins the AI war, if you will have significant advantage on the global stage. So you've got China, you've got, like, it is a global race towards
Yeah.
developing this. So then you say, okay, what are the factors behind that global race? Well, one is human manpower and capabilities and technology and so on and so forth. But another core component behind it is electricity and the cost of power, because it's such a huge component within that system. And so that's where there's going to be a fight towards this. And in the US, the easiest way to actually develop electricity fast, easily, is absolutely natural gas. It's not nuclear. I say it's not nuclear, not because nuclear is not cheaper. It is. Not because it's better. It is. But because in order to bring that supply online is going to take at least 10 years. And it's
Right.
very capital intensive. Again, we don't know in 3-4 years' time who's going to be in power, whether they're going to be anti-nuclear, pro-nuclear, all of this sort of stuff. Natural gas is easy, fast, it's there, and it'll be. So I believe that's, and
How do
it's
you
been
play
technically
that,
done.
Chris? How do you play natural gas?
There's a bunch of natural gas producers, Antero Resources, Range Resources. There's a bunch that we like to build it with any sector. I'm not of the opinion that you go out and you try and be a smart ass and try and buy the best company or whatever.
Right.
Yes, you do your due diligence on the companies, but you buy the sector by and large.
Is there
And
like an ETF that's got
no, no, there might be now, but the problem with with ETFs, and especially in commodity type
Yeah, the negative
investment,
carry that they
is
have, like the oil one, like
well,
the US.
often what they're doing is they're simply just trading futures on the underlying commodity.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. I meant like a ETF that more so had exposure to like the producers.
No, there's none that we like. So there's
Okay.
EQT. I could give you a list. EQT, like I said, Range Resources, Antero, CNX. What's another one? Southwestern. So there's a list. What's that? 4 companies, 5. Buying them as a basket, and you can market cap weight them. You could just pick how you want to weight that position in your portfolio. But those are all. I would be very surprised if those lose us money over the course of the next 2 years.
How does Argentina play into your worldview, or is it just kind of a separate bucket in the sense that you're not really looking at it because of the macro environment of the world in the next 10 years, but because Malay's coming in, making these changes, it was down and out. It was horrible. And when things go from horrible to decent, you actually make a lot of money. In fact, probably more money than when things go from good to great.
Mhm.
So is it just the horrible to decent play, or is there a long-term, macro component to it as well?
Gosh, there's so many. So the first and easiest in all of this is that Argentina was and still is unbelievably cheap.
Okay.
Okay. I mean, it's like 30 odd billion market cap, the entire economy. Like Apple's 3 trillion.
Yeah.
Okay. It's okay, so it's been a basket case for an incredibly long time. All right.
Yeah,
So you had incredibly cheap valuations, a market which was decimated as a consequence of mismanagement, regulatory overburdensome regulatory situation, fiscal mismanagement, etc., etc., etc. Now, a lot of those are all being fixed, and to the degree now that you've got like the capital controls have largely been reduced. There were capital controls with Argentines who weren't allowed to get their money out of the country and so on and so forth. They found ways to do so anyway, as people do, and now they can bring their capital back without any tax complications. Milei's done that. Anyway, there's a whole range of things that are incredibly bullish and capitalistic and positive. The overlay behind that is that on a relative basis, Argentina also de-risks one's portfolio because it's very much counter-cyclical and counter-jurisdictional. It's outside of the West.
all right.
It's not affected like militarily by things that are going on in Europe or in the Middle East,
Yeah.
right? So what you see, it's like capital flows around the world. It's like water. So if you're an investor and you're over in Switzerland and you had a whole lot of investments in, I don't know, in Europe and in the Middle East, and now you're going, oh shit, I had some stuff in Israel and now I don't really like that or whatever it's some portion of your wallet you want to look for diversification. You want to de-risk any situation that you can.
All right.
Previously, when you looked at South America, it was basically Brazil. Argentina didn't really feature because it was such a basket case. So you would even just buy into an ETF, maybe that was in Brazil, or into some mutual fund or some fund that some guy's running and it's da, da, da. So it was Chile and Brazil. Now, so that allocation of capital that goes towards a quote unquote South American sector, that's changing. It's changing for the simple fact that Chile is still quite far left. Brazil's arguably cheap now, but it's run by Lula, who's a socialist.
Yeah. Yeah.
Argentina, which is a tiny, absolutely tiny, is like the altcoin, right?
Yeah. Right.
Um, so
With
it's
the
not like
institutional money potentially flowing into it over the next 2 or 3
there's
years.
there's almost no institutional money
Right.
right now,
Right.
and so there's a number of other factors. I'll just give you a quick one as to what, and this is where, because people have come to us. I mean, we're up massively in our positions on this.
Yeah.
So a lot of people are saying, well, do you think maybe the game's over? Do we get out? Here's what happens. Firstly, FDI into Argentina it's less than 3%. There's been almost no capital coming in, despite the fact that you're seeing all of these changes. Part of that is around mandates for institutional money. and a lot of these mandates are based on all sorts of metrics. Some of those metrics, for example, are the bond market and the swap rate and the volatility of the currency. And there's a whole lot of basically this point system. So I think it's JP Morgan. Yeah, they got this. I think it's JP Morgan. They got this point system, and they so basically say you can invest into countries that are like this risk level, and all these risk
Yeah, yeah,
levels.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
It's like AAA investment grade.
Exactly. And so that does, it's kind of used as a benchmark across the institutional money management industry. So then people will look at countries and go, oh, this is this risk level. I don't want a fund managers that's taking X amount of risk, or so there's capital that can be allocated towards different risk profiles. Those with lower risk profiles get more capital. Those with higher risk profiles get less. Argentina's been in the don't invest at all risk profile. No,
Right.
I'm serious.
Right, they've
Like
been in
like
the penalty
0.
box, right? So now they're going up to potentially investment
And
grade.
so they're on their ratio when it gets to, I think it's 400 is where it basically the green light comes on.
Yeah.
It was around 3 to 4,000, right? Which is why nobody was touching the place.
Mm.
Today it's around 600. We're
And then
moving
the
very
sweet
rapidly
spot's like
towards that.
400.
And look,
Like,
most people, guys are sitting there in Wall Street. They've never even been to Argentina. They're just going to see this green light come on. They're going to go, okay, it's okay now. What do we do? Where do we look? What do we buy?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And let's allocate. And it might only be 1% of your portfolio, or 2 or 3. Now, 1% of let's just say a dozen portfolio managers with a few billion under management. 1%. This is a
Yeah,
$30 billion market cap economy.
yeah, that would really move the needle. Do you what are the politics or the political structure? What is it like down there? Does Malay have 4 years? Can he run for re-election? If
He
so,
can.
what do you think the
So
odds are that he wins again?
so it's coming up. I think it's October. We will see whether he gets full control of the house.
Okay.
I'm, as you know, pretty well connected there because I've got some other operations there as well, and it's including people who own banks and like very high up. The overwhelming opinion seems to be that he's going to take a sweep, and he's going to be able to do much more post October.
Okay.
We'll see whether that's true. Some of that I'm cautious just because I think people want to be hopeful, but even without it, he's made some massive strides in terms of decreasing
Is he pretty
regulation
popular?
in particular.
I'm assuming he is, but
He's amongst business owners, he's very popular. Amongst the working class, there's a little bit of a like, we need to see what's going on because inflation is become, I mean, it's expensive. Argentina's gone from cheap to actually pretty expensive in a very short
in
period of
dollar
time.
terms, though, but you're talking about dollar terms.
No. Even in pesos.
So
Look, the,
how
the
has he got the inflation rate down, but yet prices are going up faster than they were before?
because you had so many socialist controls in place where things like food prices and that were controlled and all. So
I
again,
thought the
over
inflation rate was coming down.
inflation has come down. It's running about 20% a year, which is high, but it was 250.
Okay, but that's my point. So if it was running at 250 and now it's 20,
It's okay.
how,
So
how did
it's
prices or
specific.
prices going up more than they were before? That doesn't make sense.
Yeah, specific goods that were protected, right? So go back and think about, we were talking about New York, and they go, oh, we're gonna like put price freezes on supermarket food and da 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 da,
Right, but
right?
that would have gone into the 250% inflation that they did have, those price controls. So now that you lift those price controls, I get it. The price of that stuff goes up, but then how has inflation gone from 250 down to 20? Why hasn't it gone from 250 up to 400? Because you lifted those price controls. Or is it that prices just adjusted higher and then stay there? That's probably what happened, Chris, because you lifted the price controls
Yeah,
and prices went way up and adjusted much higher, but then they
shock
kind of leveled
therapy.
off to where they're only going up at 20% per annum, but they had a big jump. So relative to before he was there, they're still way higher. That's probably what
So
happened.
you can see it in the currency. It's the same. So like the currency is just kind of what happened, say, in the supermarket. Try and think of it like in those terms. So you had your blue market rate. They call it blue market. I don't know why. Black market, blue market. They call it the blue market. And that spread was massive, right? So what you could get through the central bank and what you could get on the street was a huge variance. That is now,
Yeah,
for
no.
all intents and purposes, gone, right? So actually your money changes are kind of like out of business because there's no spread left. But that differential was throughout, like things like supermarkets, it was held. In other words, you could go into the supermarket, you buy an apple and it would be cheap.
Mhm.
Okay. Now that you actually allowed the market to function, that Apple wasn't like 10 cents, it's now like 20 cents. Okay. But as you said, everything's stabilized.
Yeah.
So
There's a price adjustment.
what I'm saying is that there's been a shock to the system, right? So Milei came in, he promised things, people suddenly got a shock to the system. They're like, holy shit.
Right.
So you're wealthy enough people, it didn't really matter, right? Things definitely have gotten much better because you could manage your cash flows, you got your profitability in your businesses. I mean, the place is booming. Like there's new cars everywhere. It's definitely booming. But that initial, because he's only been in power for not a particularly long period of time, right? So there was this shock whereby certainly your lower class, suddenly all the things that were subsidized are no longer subsidized, and they had this price adjustment. But my hope is, and we're seeing this in terms of the economy booming, is that now they can go out and they can get jobs because there is deployment of capital.
And wages will go up at a faster rate.
Exactly.
At rate
That's
real terms over the next, however long he has left in his
yeah.
term.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's still this sort of like, in the lower working class, there's still like is a hesitancy.
Yeah, that's what I was
In
gonna
the
say.
business class, it's definitely like very pro.
Yeah. All right, buddy. Tell people about the fund. Tell them about what you do and where they can get some info on it.
Absolutely. So the we manage what we call an asymmetric fund, which is designed really around the idea that we're going through these cyclical changes. We are buying assets and sectors that we believe will outperform. It's done very well since we've been running it. And you can find that at glenorchycapital.net, the Rebel Fund, which we are in partnership here with George.
Yours truly.
And it is for accredited investors. So that's needs to be stated. But you can reach out to us, book a call, and we can discuss whether that's right for you or not.
Yeah. And they can follow you on Twitter too to get your kind of real time thoughts. What's your handle, Chris?
It's Capitalist EXP.
And then you can go on there and people can listen to how much you love the pointy shoed globalists, right? Is that what you call them?
I don't use it as much as I used to, actually. I
But
won't
isn't
lie.
that what you call them? The pointy shoed
Pointy shoes. Yeah.
pointy
Yeah.
shoes globalists.
Yeah. Well, they
That's funny. All right, man. We got to get rolling here. So thanks for your time. Thanks for the update on copper. And we'll talk to you soon, buddy.
excellent. All the best. Thanks.